It didn't begin as a war, but it became an inferno. 264 BC. The fuse is lit. 23 years, 600 ships lost, hundreds of thousands dead. And then, victory. In defeat, Carthage forged something darker. A boy watched Rome rise. "23 years. First war. Over 1 million dead. Black sails pierced a blood-red sunset. A storm brews above the Mediterranean, not of wind, but of ambition. On the coast of Sicily, two titans prepare to collide, and the world holds its breath. They were never meant to fight. Rome ruled the land, Carthage ruled the sea, but greed knows no borders. A forgotten city cries for help. Mercenaries turn kingmakers, and suddenly, two of the most powerful civilizations in history are dragged into a war neither of them wanted, and neither of them can escape. This was the First World War in Western history, fought not for survival, but for domination. And from it, something monstrous would be born. Screams echo across a burning fleet. Roman boarding hooks crash against Carthaginian decks. An elephant falls screaming into the sea as legions storm across makeshift ships. Rome, untested, unyielding, learning to fight at sea by building an entire navy from scratch. Carthage, proud, ruthless, defending its legacy with the fury of an empire long unconquered. One mistake started it. One war redefined civilization. This is the First Punic War, and history was never the same again. Two powers, two destinies, and one small island caught in between. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the Mediterranean was not yet Rome's lake. It was Carthage's empire. From her shining harbors in North Africa, Carthage stretched her reach across the seas. There commanded a naval empire that wrapped around the western Mediterranean like a crown of iron and salt. Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearics, and, most crucially, Sicily, the beating heart of the Central Sea. Their ships were unmatched, her merchants everywhere, her wealth ancient and immeasurable. "The Carthaginians," wrote a Roman, "do not fight unless there is profit, but when they do, they devour." Rome, on the other hand, was still young. Powerful, yes, but untested beyond the Italian peninsula. The Republic had crushed the Etruscans, humbled the Samnites, and brought the Greek cities of Magna Graecia to heel. Rome's legions were feared by all who marched on land. But on water, Rome was nothing. No fleet, no tradition of naval warfare, no experience. And yet, something was changing. The Roman boot was bursting with ambition. The Senate hungered for expansion. Veterans of long campaigns in the hills of central Italy were becoming restless. Rome had begun to outgrow its boundaries. But where could it turn next? Sicily, a land of volcanoes, gold, and grain. A land caught in a 1,000-year tug-of-war between Greeks, natives, and Phoenicians. A land so rich that it had always been a prize. And now it was split, a battleground between rival city-states, mercenaries, and imperial shadows. And then it happened. In the northeastern corner of the island stood Messana, a fortress held by a rogue band of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. Cunning, brutal, opportunistic. They were under siege by Hero of Syracuse, a powerful Greek ruler determined to restore order to Sicily. Desperate, the Mamertines called out for help. First to Carthage, then to Rome. Two empires heard the cry. Two empires answered, and suddenly both had their flags flying over the same city. The Carthaginians arrived first, sending a fleet to garrison the city. The Romans hesitated, then sent a consul with legions to land on the island. Carthaginian and Roman forces now stood side by side, eyeing each other. What began as a small power play, a cynical ploy to gain influence over one city, would explode into something no one could contain. Because Messana was not just a flashpoint, it was a fuse, and it had been lit. In the shadows of volcanoes and forgotten gods, two superpowers stood face to face. Neither had planned for war, but both would soon drench the seas in blood. This is how it began, not with a declaration, but a decision. One move too bold, one ally too desperate, and one small island big enough to drown an empire. War is rarely declared. It erupts, and in 264 BC, it erupted at Messana. At first, the Roman Senate hesitated. Sicily was not their war. They had no fleet, no foothold, no right to intervene in Carthaginian territory. And yet, fear has a way of silencing reason. Because the Carthaginians were already there, entrenching their forces, seizing control, planting their black-bannered authority in the very shadow of Italy. If Rome let it stand, Carthage would dominate the Strait of Messina. There would blockade trade. There would threaten southern Italy. And the idea of a foreign fleet so close to Roman shores was intolerable. So Rome made a decision. They would cross the sea. They would answer the Mamertines. They would face Carthage. One consul, Appius Claudius Caudex, was chosen. His orders: break the siege of Messana and secure the city for Rome. It was not a war, not yet. It was a rescue mission, a limited operation, a necessary precaution. But the Republic was lying to itself. In secret, Claudius gathered an expeditionary force. Without a navy of their own, they commandeered ships from allied Greek cities, bolting makeshift decks onto transport vessels, arming merchantmen with catapults and ballistae. The fleet was crude, unfit for naval warfare. But Rome was never one to wait for perfection. They launched, and when the red-crested legions disembarked in Messana, the world changed. The Carthaginian commander, startled by the Roman arrival, attempted negotiation. But Rome had not come to negotiate. Claudius marched directly into the city and ordered the Carthaginian forces expelled. Diplomacy collapsed. Tensions snapped. In a single move, Rome had violated centuries-old balance and directly challenged the greatest naval empire in the West. Carthage retaliated immediately. Reinforcements were dispatched. A counterattack launched. The hills and coasts of Sicily became a chessboard of maneuver and siege. Allies were courted, cities bribed, loyalties tested. And within months, two full-scale armies stood locked on the island, neither willing to withdraw. At home, the Roman Senate met in emergency session. There was no more pretense. This was war. The First Punic War had begun, not by grand strategy or imperial design, but by accident, ambition, and a single consul acting just boldly enough to tip history off its rails. And yet, neither Rome nor Carthage understood what they had unleashed. They thought it would be short, A regional conflict, a show of strength. But it would become the longest war in Roman history up to that point. 23 years of blood, fire, and shipwreck. Hundreds of thousands dead, fortunes lost, empires transformed. The die had not just been cast, it had shattered the table. Now, two titans would wrestle for the soul of the Mediterranean, and only one would rise. Sicily burned. What was supposed to be a swift Roman intervention at Messana turned into a continental wildfire. The island, fertile, rich, a gateway between east and west, became the battleground of giants. Cities switched sides, fortresses fell, treaties were written in ash. Rome had never fought like this. They were a land power, unmatched on foot, but helpless at sea. Carthage, on the other hand, ruled the waves. Their ships glided across the Mediterranean like predators, swift, deadly, unstoppable. And yet Rome, as always, refused to yield. If the war would be won at sea, then Rome would build a navy. It was madness. They had no shipbuilding tradition, no trained sailors, no admirals. But the Senate ordered hundreds of ships constructed in haste, modeled on a captured Carthaginian quinquereme. It was a monstrous vessel, powered by 5 rows of oarsmen, each plank groaning under its own weight. And where Carthage had elegance, Rome brought brutality. They invented the corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that transformed naval duels into infantry battles. No longer would Roman soldiers drown helplessly as their enemies circled them. Now they could bring the fight onto the enemy's deck, where swords, not sails, decided victory. The sea would be no refuge. Rome had turned water into battlefield, and so the war evolved. In 260 BC, the Romans tested their new fleet at Mylae. Gaius Duilius, an unremarkable consul with no naval background, led the charge. As the Carthaginian ships swarmed, confident in their superiority, the Romans unleashed the corvus. One by one, enemy vessels were boarded, seized, and turned into floating slaughterhouses. It was a stunning victory. Rome, the land empire, had defeated Carthage at sea. But the war was far from over. Sicily became a land of endless siege. Roman legions pressed south. Carthaginian armies struck back from strongholds like Agrigentum and Panormus. No side could gain decisive ground. Cities changed hands again and again, each conquest soaked in the blood of both soldier and civilian. Then came a turning point. Rome decided to go bigger. In 256 BC, they launched their boldest operation yet, an invasion of North Africa itself. Under consuls Regulus and Manlius, a massive fleet carried over 40,000 men across the sea, defeating the Carthaginian navy at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, one of the largest naval clashes in history. They landed near Carthage. The enemy trembled. At first, the Roman campaign in Africa was promising. Regulus crushed Carthaginian armies and forced humiliating peace offers. Rome stood at the edge of total victory, but then, hubris. Regulus refused the Carthaginian terms. Too lenient, he said. Rome must punish, not negotiate. So Carthage turned to a mercenary commander from Sparta, Xanthippus. He brought with him a new doctrine, phalanx discipline, war elephants, and a mind sharpened in the Greek tradition of strategy. In 255 BC, Regulus's army was annihilated outside Tunis. Roman survivors were captured, enslaved, or slaughtered. Regulus himself was taken prisoner, a living symbol of arrogance undone. The African campaign ended in disaster. Rome lost its best army and nearly its fleet in a storm while retreating. But Rome would not quit. Again and again, they rebuilt. Again and again, they fought. Year after year, consuls came and went, victories and defeats mounting like coins on a funeral pyre. Both sides were exhausted. Carthage lost men, money, morale. Rome lost fleets to storms, tens of thousands to drowning. At one point, the Republic had lost nearly 600 ships, a catastrophe that would have crushed any other power. But not Rome. They simply raised new taxes, conscripted new men, and built again. The war had become a test of will, and the Senate was determined to outlast their enemy, whatever the cost. This was not conquest anymore, it was obsession. By the late 240s BC, the war dragged on like a curse. Sicily, once a paradise, had been turned into a charnel house of broken walls and starving cities. Carthaginian power was crumbling, but their fortresses in the west, particularly Lilybaeum and Drepana, still held firm. And then, the final Roman gamble. One last fleet, one final push. They mortgaged everything. Private citizens donated their wealth. Timber from all corners of Italy was brought to shipyards. The Republic went all in, again. The morning of March 10th, 241 BC, dawned cold and gray. Off the western coast of Sicily, near the Aegates Islands, the sea boiled with wind. Storms had swept the area for days. Visibility was low. The sea heaved beneath iron-colored clouds. It was no day for battle. But Rome had no choice. After 23 years of war, countless sieges, naval disasters, and oceans of blood, the Roman Republic had staked everything on this one final offensive. Their treasury was empty, their people exhausted, their enemies desperate. This was it. Commanding the Roman fleet was Gaius Lutatius Catulus, a man who had never been consul before, never led a major fleet, and yet now carried the hopes of an entire civilization on his shoulders. He had trained his men relentlessly for months while blockading the crucial Carthaginian stronghold of Lilybaeum. He knew the enemy would try to resupply it eventually, and when they did, he would be ready. Carthage, battered and starving, had summoned a final fleet of 250 ships under Hanno the Great. Their goal: break through the Roman blockade and save Sicily. But they were late, and they were rushed. Their ships were filled with supplies and rowed by hastily gathered, half-trained crews. The elite Marines were gone, most dead, others scattered. Many oarsmen were slaves, poorly chained and barely fed. Their vessels were heavier, slower, overburdened with grain and hope. Meanwhile, the Roman fleet, though slightly outnumbered, was streamlined, battle-hardened, and perfectly positioned by Catulus, who had waited patiently for this very storm. This was not just a battle of ships. It was a battle of preparation, of endurance, of resolve. And when the Carthaginian fleet came into view near the Aegates, Catulus struck. His ships surged forward, oars slicing the waves with terrifying discipline. The wind howled against Roman sails, but their captains had already adapted, ballasted for rough waters, streamlined for speed. Their ships glided like blades across the chaos. The corvus, Rome's once feared boarding bridge had been removed, too heavy for this storm. Rome no longer needed gimmicks. They had become masters of the sea. Rome had turned itself into what it hated. It had become Carthage and surpassed it. The clash was immediate. Rams slammed into hulls. Grappling hooks flew. Marines boarded. Screams echoed between walls of rain and salt. The sea turned red. The Carthaginian formation collapsed quickly. Many ships couldn't maneuver in the wind. Roman triremes cut through their ranks like wolves through a wounded herd. Some Carthaginian captains tried to flee. Others surrendered. Most went down fighting. Ships capsizing beneath flaming arrows and boarding spears. By midday, it was over. 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk, 70 more captured. Over 10,000 men were taken prisoner. The rest scattered or drowned beneath the gray Sicilian waves. It was not merely a defeat, it was annihilation. The Carthaginian admiral Hanno barely escaped. His failure would haunt him and his city for generations. Because this was not just the loss of a fleet, it was the loss of the war. When news reached Carthage, panic swept the city. There were no more fleets, no more money, no more options. They sued for peace within weeks. Rome, from the brink of collapse, had emerged triumphant. But the cost was almost unbearable. When Carthage's shattered fleet failed to return, when the last messenger arrived, soaked and hollow-eyed, with news of total defeat at Aegates, the ruling council in Carthage collapsed into silence. They knew it was over. There were no ships left to rebuild, no silver in the treasury, no mercenaries willing to fight for a lost cause. For the first time in centuries, Carthage, the queen of the seas, bowed. Peace was the only option. In the weeks that followed, Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had never lost a battle in Sicily, was forced to make an unbearable decision. Though undefeated in the field, he was abandoned by the sea and by his government. A peace delegation was sent to Rome. The terms they received were brutal, carved from Roman anger, not Roman mercy. Under the Treaty of Lutatius, Carthage was to surrender all holdings in Sicily, pay 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, an astronomical amount, release all Roman prisoners without ransom, pledge never again to wage war without Rome's consent. Carthage had no choice but to accept. It was humiliation. The proud naval empire that had once ruled the western Mediterranean now had no navy left. Sicily, the granary of Carthage, its most valuable overseas possession, became Rome's first foreign province. And Rome? Rome had done the impossible. A landlocked republic with no naval tradition had taken on the mightiest maritime power of the ancient world, and won, not through genius alone, but through grit, sacrifice, and terrifying willpower. They had lost hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, endured famine, political unrest, and near bankruptcy. But in doing so, they had forged an empire. Victory in the First Punic War marked a point of no return. Rome was no longer just a power in Italy. It was now a power across the sea. Yet victory came at a cost deeper than silver. In Carthage, bitterness fermented like poison. A young boy, no more than 9 years old, stood silently beside his father, Hamilcar Barca, as the treaty was signed. His eyes burned with humiliation. His name was Hannibal, and the fire in his heart would one day plunge the world into war again. The First Punic War had ended, but peace was an illusion. Rome, once a republic of farmers and soldiers, now tasted empire, and found it intoxicating. Carthage, though beaten, was not broken. Beneath the surface, a storm brewed, and vengeance had a name: Hannibal. The boy who watched his father fall to Roman terms would one day cross the Alps with war elephants, ignite terror across Italy, and bring the Republic to its knees. But that is another story. The First Punic War was not just a struggle for Sicily. It was the spark that lit a century of bloodshed. A war of grit, ambition, and the birth of two titans destined to clash again and again until one lay in ruins. And so we ask, what if Carthage had won? What if Hamilcar had received just one more fleet? Would the Mediterranean speak Punic today instead of Latin? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want to follow the rise of Hannibal and the war that shook Rome to its core, make sure to subscribe. The story of the Punic Wars has only just begun.